In this video, I'll talk about the Korean War, which happened between the years 1950 and 1953. To understand the war, we have to know what was going on at the moment. Between the years 1948 and 1949, the superpowers, aka the USA and the USSR, were in conflict because of the Berlin blockade. Around that time, the Communists had won the Chinese Civil War, leaving Mao Zedong as their leader. Also in 1949, the USSR had produced a nuclear weapon. Then we have the causes of the Korean War. Up to 1945, Korea had been a colony of Japan. This isn't what impulsed the war. What happened after did. When World War II ended, the north of Korea was liberated by the Soviets, making that the Communist Korea. The south, which was under the 38th parallel, was liberated by the USA. This caused conflict because of the bad relationship between the US and the USSR, leading to the invasion of the South. In the invasion of the South, North Korea was led by Kim Il-sung, who had been trained by Stalin. His aim was to reunite Korea, but in 1949, when he asked Stalin if he could do it, he rejected the idea because he was busy with the Berlin blockade. This changed a year later, because the USSR had developed nukes, the previously named nuclear weapons. They invaded the south, taking over almost all of it, including Seoul, only leaving Busan to the south of Korea. The Chinese Civil War had affected the Korean War because after the Chinese Communist Party won, the United Nations didn't recognize Mao as their leader. As a protest, the USSR left the UN Security Council. The United States took this as an advantage and summoned a military force, which was approved by the Council. There wasn't any communist country to oppose to this idea. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed to lead the American forces, but what do we know about MacArthur? Well, he was the American commander of the UN forces, which had gained recognition with the Incheon landing. MacArthur had also been part of the forces when the USA exploded the world's first atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in Japan. He was a very controversial figure at that moment because of the decisions he took when participating in the Korean War. The war was divided into 4 phases. Phase 1, which was liberating the south, began with Rhee's army being surrounded in Busan. In response to this, MacArthur launched a bold amphibious, landing further north to cut off the Northern Army. Then, in September, he landed his forces at Incheon, pushing the North Korean troops to retreat over the 38th parallel, which they had already reached by October. The second phase was the rollback. The South had already been freed from communist forces, but it wasn't enough for MacArthur. He was very keen to move beyond the 38th parallel and roll back communism. He prepared the invasion of the North, ignoring the Chinese warning that they would get involved in the war. MacArthur sent his forces to the border. The Chinese responded by sending volunteers to the border to help the North Koreans. Then, in Phase 3, the United Nations forces began to struggle as their troops were less prepared. The Chinese were less armed but had an advantage in number. Also, they had aerial help from the USSR. By the end of November, MacArthur's men were in retreat and a couple months later, the Chinese forces had captured Seoul. Later on the 4th phase, a counterattack managed to hold the Chinese forces at the 38th parallel. At this point, Truman considered peace talks, opposing MacArthur, who wanted to use their nuclear weapons. This caused him to be sacked. He was replaced by General Ridgway, who changed their strategy to defense. The Chinese were fought back. In July 1951, the two sides sat down to discuss peace terms. Their main disagreements involved the prisoners of war. Many prisoners in the south remained there, and in the north, the Chinese provided indoctrination to the UN soldiers. Later, in 1953, the Operation Big Switch began, which consisted in the return of the prisoners of war to their homelands, only if they wanted to. The war ended in 1953. Truman was replaced by Dwight Eisenhower and Stalin died, leaving Nikita Khrushchev in charge. In July, a ceasefire was agreed by all sides except by Rhee. Up to this day, a peace treaty between North Korea and South Korea was never signed, so technically they're still at war. The consequences of the war for Korea were the death of millions, the devastation of both Koreas, and their division being permanent. Other consequences of the Korean War were the Cold War and the global unity. The Cold War was led to Asia, making it the focal point. It encouraged the nuclear race between the US and the USSR, and it also intensified the superpowers' ideological differences. The Korean War proved that the United Nations was serious about collective security, and it led to the creation of the SATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Finally, the Truman Doctrine was put in action, which consisted in the containment of the Soviet geopolitical expansion. After all of this, who won the war? Was there a winner? I will tell you different points of view regarding the situation. China could be considered the winner because they held the US to draw, they reinstalled the communist power in China, they had a big military growth, and they came out strong from the war. Then we have the Soviet Union, which could also be considered the winner because Stalin influenced North Korea. It preserved its communist influence, and China had a big military growth. Last but not least, we have the USA, which contained the spread of communism, gained back the territory of South Korea with the United Nations' help, and it ended up with fewer casualties than both North Korea and China. Now that we are reaching the end of the video, here we have the reasons why the war between the two Koreas is considered a draw. North Korea's side, we have Kim Il-sung, who managed to make the UN forces take a step back and managed to keep North Korea's territory. On the other side, we have Seung-ri. He managed to keep South Korea's territory and also had a big military growth as a result from the war. Neither of these countries ended up with a more beneficial outcome than the other, so it is considered a draw. Thanks for watching our video explaining the Korean War.